you can spare a little of your time to listen to this experience, you will be among those God is destined to know about a secret underground substance that will be released to destroy lives in America. You will also hear about a virus that will soon take root in America and spread to many nations, worse than COVID-19. Lastly, you will learn about 4 states that Jesus revealed and the inevitable disaster that will befall them. Kindly tell us where you are watching from so we can connect as one family, and also drop a word of prayer for someone in the comments section. I will now begin sharing today's experience. My name is Wei Chen, and for 32 years, I served in the Chinese military. I was trained to trust only what I could see, measure, and verify. Facts, data, intelligence reports. That was my world. The idea of heaven, angels, or any kind of spiritual encounter seemed like stories people told themselves to feel better about death. I was wrong. What happened to me on January 17, 2026, shattered everything I thought I knew about reality. But before I tell you about that day, I need to explain how I even found myself in a position to hear from God. It started months earlier, in September 2025, when I was scrolling through my phone late one night. It was a restless evening in September. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with thoughts about my future, my family, and the state of the world. I picked up my phone and started scrolling through videos, looking for something to distract me. That's when I stumbled upon a channel called Afterlife Info. The thumbnail showed a woman's face in bold text that read something about dying and meeting Jesus and warnings about October 2025. I remember scoffing at it. Just another attention-seeking story, I thought. People love making up dramatic tales about dying and coming back to life. It's all nonsense designed to get views and make money. I swiped past it without even clicking. But that wasn't the last time I saw that channel. Over the next few weeks, videos from Afterlife Info kept appearing in my feed. Different people, different stories, but always the same theme. Near-death experiences, heaven, hell, encounters with Jesus, warnings about the future. Each time one popped up, I would shake my head and swipe it away. I had no interest in fairy tales. These people are either lying or hallucinating, I would mutter to myself. When you die, your brain shuts down. And that's it. There's nothing after. No heaven. No hell. Just darkness. That was my firm belief. Death was the end of consciousness, the final shutdown of the biological machine we call a human body. Anyone claiming otherwise was either delusional or trying to sell something. So every time those videos appeared, and they appeared often, I dismissed them without a second thought. I had more important things to worry about than ghost stories and religious propaganda. Little did I know that my entire worldview was about to be turned upside down. By early January 2026, my life had settled into a routine. I had recently retired from active military service and was trying to adjust to civilian life. It wasn't easy. After decades of structure, discipline, and clear missions, I felt lost. What was my purpose now? What was I supposed to do with the rest of my life? My wife noticed my restlessness. She would say I needed to find something meaningful to occupy my time, maybe volunteer, or start a hobby, or spend more time with the grandchildren. She was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was a hollowness inside me that I couldn't explain. I had accomplished much in my career, served my country with honor, raised a family, and yet I felt empty. I started taking long walks in the evenings, thinking about life and death more than I ever had before. My own mortality was becoming more real to me. I was no longer a young soldier. I was a man in his 50s facing the reality that more years were behind me than ahead. It was during one of these contemplative walks that everything changed. January 17th started as an ordinary day. The weather was cold and crisp. I woke up early, made tea, read the news, and went about my usual morning routine. Nothing felt unusual or different. In the afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I had been thinking a lot about my father, who had passed away 2 years earlier. I missed him. I wished I could talk to him one more time, ask him questions about life that I had never thought to ask when he was alive. As I walked to the park near my home, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. It wasn't pain exactly, just a pressure, like something was weighing on me. I thought maybe I was stressed or tired. I found a bench and sat down to rest. That's when it happened. Without warning, my vision blurred. The trees around me started to shimmer and fade. I felt a sudden rush of energy through my body, like electricity flowing through my veins. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't obey. I tried to call out, but no sound came from my mouth. And then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time didn't seem to exist in the place I went to. One moment I was sitting on a park bench, and the next I was standing in a space that defied description. It wasn't a room exactly, but it wasn't open sky either. It was like being inside a vast chamber made of light and shadow. The floor beneath my feet was solid but transparent, like walking on glass. When I looked down, I could see layers upon layers of what looked like clouds or mist swirling beneath me. I was terrified. I shouted, asking where I was, but my voice echoed strangely, as if the space was both enormous and intimate at the same time. I looked around frantically, trying to understand what was happening. Was I dreaming? Was I dead? Had I suffered a heart attack on that bench? That's when I saw it, a hallway stretching out before me, lined with doors. 12 doors in total, arranged in a perfect line. Some of the doors glowed with warm golden light seeping out from underneath and around the edges. Others were completely dark, no light at all, just solid black doors that seemed to absorb any illumination near them. I counted the doors, 12 of them. The first door glowed brightly. The second, third, and fourth doors were pitch black. The remaining doors, 5 through 12 all, had varying degrees of light, some brighter than others, but none as dark as those three. I stood there, confused and frightened, staring at this impossible hallway. Nothing made sense. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream or a hallucination. That's when I heard the voice. The voice was gentle but powerful, like thunder wrapped in velvet. It came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I spun around, looking for the source, but saw no one. The voice called my name again, telling me not to be afraid. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst from my chest. I managed to whisper, asking who was speaking and where I was. There was a pause, and then a figure began to materialize before me. At first it was just a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. But slowly, the shimmer took shape and form. It was a man. Or rather, it was a being in the form of a man. He was dressed in simple white robes that seemed to glow with their own light. His face was kind, but carried an authority that made me want to fall to my knees. His eyes were deep and endless, like looking into eternity itself. I knew immediately who he was, even though I had never believed in him before. I whispered his name, my voice trembling. He smiled at me, and in that smile, I felt more love than I had ever experienced in my entire life. It wasn't romantic love or familial love. It was something greater, pure, unconditional, and complete. He confirmed his identity and told me he had brought me here for a purpose. I wanted to argue, to say this couldn't be real, that I didn't believe in him, but standing in his presence, all my atheism, all my skepticism, all my military training and logical thinking evaporated like mist in the morning sun. I knew, beyond any doubt, that I was standing before the Son of God. I asked why I was there, my voice barely above a whisper. He gestured toward the hallway with the 12 doors. He explained that he was going to show me what was to come, and that the doors represented the months of this year. Each door was a month, from January to December. I looked at the doors again with new understanding. The first door, glowing brightly, must be January, the month we were in. The dark doors, second, third, and fourth, would be February, March, and April. My stomach tightened with fear. Why were those months dark? What did it mean? Jesus must have sensed my fear, because he placed his hand on my shoulder. The touch sent warmth flooding through my entire body, calming my racing heart. He told me to come with him, that he would show me 3 things that were to come, 3 warnings that I must share with others. He said the time was short and that people needed to know and prepare. He led me toward the second door, the first of the dark ones. As we approached, I noticed the temperature seemed to drop. The warmth I had felt moments ago faded, replaced by a creeping coldness that made me shiver. Jesus placed his hand on the door, and it swung open silently. Beyond the door was not another room, but what looked like a window into the world, into the month of February 2026. He told me to step through, explaining that I would see, but not be seen, that I would be a witness. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the doorway. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt a rush of sensation, as if I had been transported from one dimension to another. Suddenly, I was standing in what looked like a massive manufacturing facility. The building was enormous, filled with conveyor belts, robotic arms, and workers in white protective suits moving with practiced efficiency. The noise was overwhelming: machinery humming, belts whirring, bottles clinking as they moved down the production line. I watched as thousands upon thousands of small bottles were being filled with the clear liquid, capped, labeled, and packed into boxes. The label on each bottle showed a cheerful image of an elderly couple smiling, with bold text that read something about senior health and sharper memory. The scene shifted, and I saw a commercial playing on a giant screen. An announcer's voice, warm and reassuring, spoke about how this product was a breakthrough supplement specifically designed for people over 60. The commercial promised better cognitive function, improved memory, increased energy, and enhanced overall health. Testimonials from happy seniors flashed across the screen, all praising the product. The announcer concluded by saying it was coming to stores everywhere in February, urging people not to miss out on this health revolution. I turned to Jesus, who was standing beside me, watching the scene with a look of deep sadness on his face. I told him I didn't understand what was wrong with a health supplement for seniors. He gestured toward the manufacturing facility, and suddenly my vision changed. It was as if I could see beneath the surface of things, see the truth hidden behind the marketing and the promises. The liquid in those bottles was not what the label claimed. Yes, it contained vitamins and minerals, but it also contained something else, something deliberately added to cause harm. Chemical compounds designed to accelerate cognitive decline, ingredients that would slowly, gradually damage the parts of the brain responsible for memory and thought. Jesus revealed to me the evil intention behind this product. There were people, powerful people in positions of authority who understood something important about elderly believers. They understood that many of the most powerful prayer warriors, the people who spent hours interceding for their families, their nations, and the world, were seniors, retired grandparents with time on their hands and deep faith in their hearts. These were the people who woke up early to pray, who fasted regularly, who had learned through decades of life how to touch heaven with their prayers. These elderly believers were a spiritual force that the enemy wanted to neutralize. He showed me that the plan was diabolical in its simplicity. If you could rob these prayer warriors of their memory and their mental clarity, you could effectively silence them. A person with dementia cannot remember to pray. A person losing their mind cannot focus long enough to intercede. A person confused and frightened by their own declining faculties becomes dependent on others, rather than being a source of strength and wisdom. But there was an even darker purpose. Jesus revealed to me that God's plan for many elderly believers was not just to pray, but to be living examples to younger generations, to show young people what a life of faith looks like in its mature stages, to demonstrate that serving God brings peace, purpose, and dignity, even in old age. The enemy wanted to destroy that witness. He wanted young people to look at elderly believers and see only confusion, decline, and fear not wisdom, faith, and godly character. Jesus told me solemnly that this product would be sold out within weeks of its release. Many would buy it, hoping to protect their health. But those who took it regularly would begin to notice changes within months. Their memory would start to fail. They would forget names, appointments, conversations. They would become confused easily. And within a year, many would be diagnosed with early onset dementia. The scene shifted again, and I saw the aftermath. What I witnessed next broke my heart into pieces. I saw elderly believers sitting in chairs, people who had once been vibrant and full of wisdom, now staring blankly at walls. Their eyes were empty, vacant, as if the light inside them had been extinguished. Some didn't recognize their own children when they came to visit. Others couldn't remember the names of grandchildren they had held as babies. I saw a grandmother who had led a weekly prayer group for 15 years. She had been the anchor, the one who encouraged others, who prayed with such power and faith that miracles happened regularly in that group. Now she sat confused in a nursing home, unable to remember why people were gathering in the room around her. The prayer group had dissolved because without her leadership, the others didn't know how to continue. I saw a grandfather who had been known in his church as a man of incredible wisdom. People would come to him with their problems, and he would listen carefully, pray, and then offer guidance that seemed to come straight from God's heart. Young men in the church looked up to him as a spiritual father. Now he couldn't even remember what day it was. When his grandson came to visit and asked for advice about a job decision, the old man just stared at him with frightened, confused eyes. The impact rippled through families in devastating ways. Adult children found themselves caring for parents who had cared for them, but it was happening too soon, too fast. These parents were in their 60s and 70s, not their 90s. They should have had at least another decade or two of sharp minds and active lives. Instead, they were fading away right before their family's eyes. I watched marriages crumble under the strain, a husband watching his wife of 40 years slowly disappear into the fog of dementia. They had planned to spend their retirement years traveling, serving in their church, enjoying their grandchildren together. Instead, he found himself alone, caring for someone who sometimes didn't even recognize him. The grief was unbearable. But the spiritual impact was what Jesus wanted me to see most clearly. Jesus showed me prayer meetings that used to be filled with elderly intercessors, now nearly empty. These weren't large, famous prayer gatherings. They were small groups that met in homes, in church basements, in the early morning hours before most people were awake. Nobody knew about them except the participants and heaven. But these groups had been powerful. They had been praying for a revival, for their communities, for their nation, for the salvation of their children and grandchildren. They had been standing in the gap, interceding faithfully, consistently, for years and even decades. Now those groups were falling apart, not because people had lost faith, but because they had lost their minds. The enemy had found a way to silence them without persecution, without obvious spiritual attack. Just a simple health supplement that promised to help but actually destroyed. I saw young adults making decisions that would harm their futures, getting involved with wrong relationships, making poor career choices, falling into addictions. And there was no grandmother praying them through it. The prayer covering that had protected them was gone. I saw communities that had been slowly improving, where crime had been decreasing and hope had been increasing, suddenly slide backward. Nobody could point to a specific cause, but Jesus showed me the truth. The elderly intercessors who had been praying faithfully for those neighborhoods were now sitting in chairs, unable to remember their own names, much less pray for their cities. I saw churches struggling. Many churches rely heavily on the faithful prayers of elderly members who may not be physically strong enough to serve in many ways, but who pray powerfully. With those prayer warriors mentally incapacitated, the spiritual strength of these churches began to weaken. Pastors felt it but couldn't explain it. Things that used to work didn't work anymore. People who were close to salvation seemed to slip away at the last moment. The atmosphere felt heavier, darker. Jesus revealed to me that this was spiritual warfare at its most insidious. The enemy had learned that direct persecution often strengthens believers. But if you can take away their mental capacity without them even knowing they're under attack, you can neutralize them completely. What made this even more sinister was how precisely the product was targeted at believers. Jesus showed me that the marketing campaign for this supplement would specifically target Christian networks. Advertisements would appear on Christian radio stations, in church bulletins, in magazines that elderly Christians read. The company producing it would make donations to Christian charities, sponsor Christian events, and hire Christian celebrities to endorse it. Everything about the marketing would be designed to make elderly believers trust the product and feel that using it was a wise, godly decision for stewarding their health. I saw testimonials that would be featured in the advertising, real people, real Christians, talking about how the supplement had helped them. But what I was shown is that these testimonials would be gathered in the first few weeks after the product's release, before the harmful effects had time to manifest. The people giving testimonials genuinely believed the product was helping them at that point. They had no idea what would happen 6 months down the road. There would even be Christian doctors endorsing the product, doctors who had been deceived by falsified research data. These were good people, sincere believers who thought they were helping their elderly patients. They had no idea they were being used as tools to spread something harmful. The deception was so complete, so well-crafted, that discernment would be required to see through it. And that's exactly what Jesus was providing through this warning. Beyond the cognitive decline, Jesus showed me other health effects that would develop in people taking this supplement regularly. The formula was designed to appear beneficial. At first, people would actually feel a slight energy boost in the first few weeks, which would convince them the product was working. But within 3 to 6 months, other problems would begin to emerge. I saw people developing tremors in their hands, at first mild, easily dismissed as normal aging, but gradually becoming more pronounced. Some would be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, but it wasn't natural Parkinson's, it was chemically induced. I saw digestive issues becoming common among users. Unexplained nausea, loss of appetite, weight loss that concerned family members. Doctors would run tests but find nothing definitive, just a vague sense that the body's systems were being disrupted at a fundamental level. Sleep disturbances would plague many users. People who had slept well for years would suddenly find themselves lying awake at night, or waking frequently, or experiencing vivid nightmares. The supplement was interfering with the brain's normal sleep cycles, and without quality sleep, cognitive decline would accelerate even faster. Some people would develop unusual anxiety and paranoia. Elderly believers who had been characterized by peace and trust would become fearful and suspicious. They would start accusing family members of stealing from them, or believe that neighbors were plotting against them. This would create family conflict and isolation, exactly when these seniors most needed support and connection. The truly heartbreaking part was that when family members took their elderly loved ones to doctors, the symptoms would be diagnosed as normal age-related decline or natural disease progression. Very few medical professionals would make the connection to the supplement because it was being marketed as beneficial, not harmful. The deception would continue unchallenged for months or even years before anyone realized what was really happening. Jesus showed me specific families being torn apart by this situation. I watched a daughter who had always been close to her mother. They talked on the phone every day, prayed together, shared everything. The mother was only 68, healthy and active, deeply involved in her church and community. Within 6 months of starting the supplement, the mother began to change. She forgot conversations they'd had just days earlier. She missed scheduled phone calls, something she had never done. When the daughter visited, her mother seemed confused about recent events, though she could recall things from decades past with perfect clarity. The daughter was terrified. She took her mother to doctor after doctor, but each one said essentially the same thing. Early onset Alzheimer's, cause unknown, no cure available, expect progressive decline. The daughter's grief was overwhelming. She was watching her best friend disappear. But what made it even worse was the spiritual impact. The daughter had always relied on her mother's prayers. When she faced decisions or difficulties, she would call her mom, and her mom would pray with such faith and power that peace would flood in. Now when the daughter called, her mother sometimes didn't even remember who she was. I saw a marriage where the husband had been the spiritual leader of the family for 45 years. He had raised 5 children with his wife, all of whom were serving God because of his example and prayers. He had been looking forward to having more time to mentor young men in his church, to invest in the next generation. But after starting the supplement, his mental clarity began to fade. His wife noticed first. He would forget appointments, repeat himself, get confused about simple tasks. Within a year, he required constant supervision. He could no longer drive, manage finances, or even dress himself independently. His adult children watched their strong father become like a confused child. The role reversal was devastating, and the young men he had been mentoring drifted away because there was no one else to step into that role. The spiritual legacy he had hoped to leave was being stolen by cognitive decline that appeared to be natural but was actually induced. Jesus emphasized to me repeatedly how important the prayer ministry of elderly believers is to the kingdom of God. He showed me that there are elderly men and women scattered across the world who spend hours each day in prayer. Nobody sees them. Nobody knows their names. They don't have titles or platforms or social media followings, but they are mighty in the spirit realm. Their prayers move heaven. Angels are dispatched in response to their intercession. Demons flee before their declarations of God's word. Prodigal children come home because of their prayers. Marriages are saved because of their prayers. Churches are revived because of their prayers. Nations are spared judgment because of their prayers. These intercessors are often elderly because they have both the time and the spiritual maturity to pray effectively. They walked with God for decades. They know His character, His promises, His ways. They've seen Him answer prayer countless times, which builds their faith to pray even more boldly. The enemy knows this. He knows that if he can silence these prayer warriors, he can accomplish much more evil in the earth. Without their prayers as a protective covering, darkness can spread more easily. That's why this supplement was being created and targeted specifically at this demographic. It was a strategic strike against the spiritual defense system that elderly believers provide through their prayers. Jesus revealed to me that in heaven, the prayers of these elderly intercessors are like incense rising before God's throne. The book of Revelation speaks of the prayers of the saints being offered before God, and these faithful elderly believers are major contributors to those prayers. When their minds are stolen through dementia, those prayers cease. The incense stops rising, and the enemy gains ground because the spiritual resistance weakens. Jesus made it clear to me that families and churches need to be warned and prepared. Those who are younger need to understand the treasure they have in their elderly believing family members and church members. These seniors are not burdens to be endured. They are warriors to be honored and protected. Churches need to recognize that their elderly members who faithfully attend prayer meetings are providing spiritual covering that benefits the entire congregation. When these prayer warriors are silenced by cognitive decline, the whole church suffers, even if they don't realize the connection. Families need to be cautious about any new health products their elderly loved ones want to try, especially ones that promise cognitive benefits. There's often a temptation to grab onto anything that claims it can prevent or reverse mental decline because the fear of dementia is so great. But that fear makes people vulnerable to deception. Jesus told me that families should pray together about decisions regarding supplements and medications for their elderly loved ones. They should research thoroughly, consult with trusted healthcare providers who share their faith, and most importantly, seek God's guidance before starting anything new. He also emphasized that the best protection for cognitive health is not a supplement but a strong spiritual life. Elderly believers who stay connected to God through daily prayer, Bible reading, worship, and fellowship are building neural pathways that actually protect brain health. The discipline of memorizing scripture, meditating on God's word, and engaging in deep prayer requires significant mental activity that keeps the mind sharp. But beyond the purely physical benefits, there is spiritual protection. Those who abide in Christ, who stay close to Him, receive His supernatural protection over their minds and bodies. No chemical formula can override God's protective power over those who belong to Him and walk closely with Him. Jesus gave me specific instruction to share with elderly believers about how to protect themselves from this coming attack. The first and most important thing is to strengthen their relationship with God right now, before February comes. Spend time in prayer daily, read and memorize scripture, worship regularly, stay connected to a strong church community. He said that seniors should be skeptical of products that seem too good to be true, especially ones heavily marketed with testimonials and promises of quick results. If a supplement claims to dramatically improve memory and cognitive function, that should be a red flag, not an attraction. The brain is incredibly complex, and legitimate improvements in brain health come from lifestyle factors like good nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management, and mental stimulation, not from a pill. Seniors should consult with their healthcare providers before starting any new supplement, especially if they are already taking medications. They should look for healthcare providers who will take time to listen to their concerns and who won't push products on them aggressively. They should also confide in trusted family members or friends before making decisions about new health products. Having accountability and wise counsel can prevent costly mistakes. But most importantly, Jesus emphasized that seniors should trust in God for their health and vitality, not in human solutions. This doesn't mean rejecting all medical care or all supplements. God often works through medicine and healthcare, but it means keeping ultimate trust in God, not in bottles and pills. He reminded me to tell seniors that God has a purpose for them in their later years. They are not useless or irrelevant just because they're retired or physically limited. Their prayers are powerful. Their wisdom is valuable. Their example matters. The enemy wants to steal their remaining years because he knows they can still do significant damage to his kingdom through faithful prayer and godly living. Therefore, seniors need to guard their minds carefully, both from physical threats like harmful supplements and from spiritual threats like discouragement, isolation, and the lie that they no longer matter. As the vision of February faded, Jesus led me back into the hallway of doors. My heart was still heavy from everything I had seen regarding the attack on elderly believers. But he told me there was more I needed to witness, more warnings I needed to carry back. We approached the third door representing March. This door seemed even darker than February's, radiating an almost palpable sense of dread. I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety about what I was about to see. Jesus opened the door and again gestured for me to step through. I took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. This time, I found myself in what appeared to be a high-level research laboratory. Scientists in protective gear worked at various stations, handling equipment I couldn't identify. The atmosphere was sterile, cold, focused. These were not people engaged in benevolent research to help humanity. I could sense the darkness of their purpose even before understanding what they were doing. The scene shifted, and I was now observing what looked like a secret meeting. People in expensive business attire sat around a conference table in a room with no windows. Documents were spread before them, and a presentation displayed on screens showed complex biological diagrams and statistical projections. Though I couldn't hear their words directly, Jesus gave me understanding of what was being planned. These people were preparing to release a new virus into the world. This was not a naturally occurring pathogen. It had been deliberately created in a laboratory, engineered with specific characteristics designed to cause maximum disruption to society. My blood ran cold. I had heard conspiracy theories about engineered viruses before, but I had always dismissed them as paranoid fantasies. Now I was being shown that such things were not only possible, but actively happening. Jesus revealed to me the characteristics of this engineered pathogen. Unlike COVID-19, which had primarily affected the elderly and those with underlying health conditions, this new virus had been designed to target a different demographic: children, teenagers, and young adults. The virus had been engineered to be highly contagious, spreading even more easily than COVID-19. It would be transmissible through respiratory droplets, surface contact, and possibly even through asymptomatic carriers who showed no signs of illness themselves but could infect others. The incubation period was designed to be relatively long, 7 to 10 days between exposure and the first symptoms. This meant that infected people would be spreading the virus for over a week before they even knew they were sick, allowing it to establish itself widely before containment measures could be implemented. But what made this virus particularly insidious was the symptom progression. It would start mildly, mimicking a common cold or flu: sneezing, coughing, low-grade fever, body aches. Most people would assume it was just a seasonal illness and continue their normal activities, further spreading the infection. However, around day 5 to 7 of the illness, the virus would suddenly become much more severe. The fever would spike dramatically. Respiratory distress would develop rapidly, and then the truly frightening symptoms would manifest: neurological involvement. Jesus showed me that this virus had been engineered to cross the blood-brain barrier and attack the central nervous system. Infected people, especially children and young adults, would begin experiencing seizures, muscle paralysis, and in severe cases, encephalitis, inflammation of the brain itself. The mortality rate was significantly higher than COVID-19, particularly in the 5 to 35 age range. Jesus revealed to me that this was intentional. The people behind this release wanted to create maximum psychological impact on society. When parents watched their healthy children become critically ill, when young adults in the prime of life collapsed, the panic and fear would be far greater than anything experienced with COVID-19. Jesus showed me the methodology of how this virus would be introduced to the population. It would not emerge naturally or accidentally. It would be deliberately released in multiple locations simultaneously through contaminated products distributed to those areas. I saw shipments of certain consumer goods items that people use regularly and wouldn't suspect being deliberately contaminated with the virus before being sent to major cities around the world. These products would be handled by many people during their normal use, allowing the virus to spread quickly through communities. The release was planned for mid-March, time to take advantage of certain seasonal factors that would accelerate transmission. Schools would still be in session. People would be gathering indoors due to weather in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Spring break travel would be beginning in some places, which would help spread the virus geographically. The locations chosen for the initial release were strategic: major population centers on different continents, cities with international airports and significant business travel, places where the virus could spread rapidly and then be carried to other regions by travelers before anyone realized what was happening. Jesus revealed to me that the people behind this release had learned from COVID-19. They had studied what worked and what didn't in terms of creating societal disruption. They had engineered this new virus to be more effective at spreading and more psychologically terrifying than anything the world had experienced before. The vision showed me how events would unfold through March and into the following months. In mid-March, there would be the first scattered cases in several cities simultaneously. At first, these would appear unconnected: a mysterious illness in London, unusual symptoms in New York, a strange flu in Tokyo, unexplained cases in Sydney. Local health officials would investigate each outbreak separately, not yet realizing they were dealing with the same pathogen spreading globally. The mild initial symptoms would cause most people to dismiss it as just another seasonal illness. But by late March, the pattern would become impossible to ignore. As patients who had been sick for 5 to 7 days suddenly deteriorated with severe neurological symptoms, emergency rooms would be flooded. Doctors would realize they were dealing with something new and terrifying. The media would begin reporting on the mysterious illness affecting primarily young people. Parents would panic. Schools would face impossible decisions about whether to stay open or close. The world, still traumatized and exhausted from COVID-19, would react with even greater fear and desperation to this new threat. By early April, The virus would be spreading rapidly in dozens of countries. The World Health Organization would declare it a pandemic. Governments would implement emergency measures. Lockdowns would be ordered. Travel would be restricted. Society would begin to shut down again. But this time, the psychological impact would be even more devastating than COVID-19 because the victims were different. It's one thing for society to accept that elderly people and those with pre-existing conditions are vulnerable to a virus. It's entirely another thing to watch healthy children and young adults dying. Jesus showed me hospitals overwhelmed with critically ill young patients, pediatric intensive care units filled beyond capacity, desperate parents keeping vigil beside ventilators, praying their children would survive. Medical staff pushed to the breaking point, both physically and emotionally, as they watched patient after patient deteriorate despite their best efforts. The treatments that had been developed for COVID-19 were ineffective against this new virus. Antiviral medications didn't work. Ventilators helped with breathing but couldn't address the neurological damage. The only thing that determined survival was the strength of the individual patient's immune system, and even healthy immune systems struggled against this engineered pathogen. Schools closed again, but this time the closure felt different. During COVID-19, school closures were seen as an inconvenience and a disruption to education. This time, they were seen as absolutely essential because children were actually dying. Playgrounds sat empty. Sports fields were silent. The laughter and energy of young people that had just begun to return to normal life vanished again. Parents became terrified to let their children have any contact with other people. Teenagers were isolated in their rooms, forbidden from seeing friends. The mental health crisis that had developed among young people during COVID-19 would intensify dramatically. The economic impact would be staggering. Businesses that had barely survived COVID-19 would collapse entirely. Supply chains that had finally recovered would break down again. But this time, there would be less resilience in the system. Companies had used up their reserves surviving the previous pandemic. They had no cushion left for another prolonged crisis. Entire industries would be devastated. Travel and tourism, already battered by COVID-19, would face near total collapse. Restaurants and entertainment venues would close permanently. Retail businesses would shut down. Unemployment would skyrocket. But Jesus emphasized to me that the economic and physical devastation, as terrible as it would be, was not the true goal. There was a deeper, darker purpose behind this planned pandemic. Jesus revealed to me that the real objective was spiritual and psychological. The people behind this virus release understood that fear is one of the enemy's most powerful weapons. When people are terrified, they stop thinking clearly. They stop trusting God. They become willing to accept things they would normally reject. This virus was designed to create a specific kind of fear, the fear of parents for their children. There is perhaps no more powerful human emotion than parental love and the desire to protect one's children. When parents are terrified that their children might die, they will do almost anything to keep them safe. The enemy's plan was to use that fear to manipulate people into accepting solutions that compromise their freedom and their faith. Jesus showed me that during this pandemic, there would be increasing pressure to accept certain medical interventions, to comply with government mandates, and to surrender personal liberties in exchange for the promise of safety. People would be told that refusing these measures was selfish, that it endangered others, especially children. Those who questioned or hesitated would be shamed and vilified. The social pressure would be enormous. Many believers would find themselves caught between their faith convictions and the desperate desire to protect their children. The conflict would tear at their hearts. Some would compromise their convictions out of fear. Others would stand firm but face immense stress and condemnation from society. Jesus showed me that the enemy's goal was to steal the faith of a generation. He wanted young people to grow up believing that the world was a terrifying, unstable place where hope was foolish and trust in God was naive. He wanted to create a generation marked by anxiety, despair, and hopelessness. Additionally, this pandemic was designed to further erode trust in institutions and in fellow human beings. COVID-19 had already created significant social division. This new crisis would deepen those divisions. People would turn on each other. Communities that should pull together would instead fracture apart. But Jesus made it clear to me that while this virus would come and would cause real suffering, it would not accomplish what the enemy intended. He showed me that God had a plan to protect and strengthen His people through this crisis. Those who stayed close to Him would have supernatural peace even in the midst of chaos. They would be able to think clearly when others were panicking. They would make wise decisions when others were reacting out of fear. They would be anchors of stability for their families and communities. Jesus revealed that the key to surviving this crisis spiritually and emotionally would be trust. Those who truly trusted God, not just intellectually, but deeply, in their hearts, would be protected from the spirit of fear that would grip so many people. He showed me families gathered together in prayer, committing their children to God's care and refusing to bow to the fear that surrounded them. These families would experience genuine peace that defied logic. Even if someone in their family became sick, they would walk through it without falling into despair. He showed me churches that remained open or found creative ways to gather despite restrictions, providing spiritual strength and community support when people needed it most. These churches would become lighthouses in the storm, drawing people who were desperate for hope. Jesus emphasized that believers should not respond to this crisis with denial or recklessness. Wisdom and prudence are godly attributes. Taking reasonable precautions to protect health is not a lack of faith, but there's a difference between wise caution and paralyzing fear, and believers must stay on the side of faith. He told me that the most important thing believers could do to prepare for this coming pandemic was to strengthen their relationship with Him now. Build a foundation of trust now. Practice hearing His voice now. Learn to distinguish His peace from the world's panic now. Because when March comes, those who have a strong connection with God will be able to weather the storm, while those whose faith is shallow will be swept away by fear. Jesus gave me specific guidance to share with people about preparing for this virus. On the practical level, people should take steps to strengthen their immune systems through good nutrition, regular exercise, adequate sleep, and stress management. They should have basic medical supplies at home. They should have a plan for how their family would handle a quarantine situation if it became necessary. But the spiritual preparation was far more important. He urged people to start now, building their faith. Spend time in prayer daily. Read and meditate on Scripture, especially passages about God's protection and faithfulness. Memorize verses that speak of peace and trust to have them readily available when fear tries to take hold. He said families should talk openly about their faith and their trust in God. Parents should prepare their children spiritually, teaching them that God is bigger than any virus, that He is in control even when the world seems chaotic. These conversations should happen now, before the crisis hits, so that when it does, children already have a foundation of trust to stand on. Churches should use this warning to prepare their congregations spiritually. Teaching series on fear and faith would be valuable. Prayer meetings, focused on interceding for protection and strength, would build spiritual resilience. Creating support systems within the church now would ensure that when the crisis hits, people aren't isolated, but are connected to a community of faith. Jesus also emphasized the importance of rejecting the spirit of fear that would permeate society. Fear is not from God. When people find themselves overwhelmed by fear about this coming virus, they need to recognize that as a spiritual attack and actively resist it through prayer, worship, and declaring God's promises. He showed me that believers who stood firm in faith during this crisis would have unprecedented opportunities to minister to others. When everyone around them was falling apart, their peace would be noticeable. People would ask them how they could be so calm. That would open doors to share about the source of their peace, their relationship with Jesus. Jesus revealed to me that while the enemy intended this pandemic to increase darkness, God would use it to increase light in those who belong to Him. The contrast between believers and non-believers would become stark. Non-believers would be characterized by fear, anxiety, anger, and despair. They would fight over resources. They would blame others. They would make decisions based purely on self-preservation. Their lives would reflect the chaos and darkness of the enemy's plan. But believers who stayed close to God would be characterized by peace, hope, generosity, and love. They would help their neighbors. They would share resources. They would speak words of encouragement. They would pray for the sick. They would be the hands and feet of Jesus in a dark time. This contrast would be so noticeable that many people would be drawn to faith. When they saw believers responding so differently to the same crisis everyone was facing, they would want what believers had. This would lead to significant harvest of souls, even in the midst of tremendous difficulty. Jesus showed me that some of the most powerful testimonies of faith would come from believing parents whose children contracted the virus. Instead of falling into despair, these parents would trust God, pray fervently, and see miracles. Their children would recover when medical science said they shouldn't. The testimonies would spread and bring glory to God. He also showed me that the prayers of believers during this crisis would limit the damage the enemy intended to cause. Every prayer offered in faith would push back darkness. Every declaration of God's sovereignty would restrict the enemy's ability to operate. The death toll would be significant, but it would have been far worse without the prayers of God's people. As the vision of March faded, I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what I had seen. 2 months of darkness revealed, and yet there was still a third door to enter. Jesus, sensing my exhaustion, placed his hand on my shoulder again, sending strength into me. He led me to the fourth door representing April. Unlike the previous 2 doors that had seemed to radiate specific types of darkness, this door pulsed with a sense of chaos and disruption, as if multiple disasters were compressed into 1 month. Jesus opened the door and we stepped through together this time. The vision that unfolded was different from the others. Instead of seeing one specific event or situation, I saw the United States as if from high above, as if I were looking down from space at the entire country. But something was very wrong. 5 states glowed with a dark red light that pulsed like a warning beacon. Jesus spoke their names clearly: California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. He told me that these 5 states would experience unprecedented simultaneous crises that would ripple across the entire nation. The vision zoomed in on Pennsylvania, and I found myself hovering over the state as if I were a bird flying above it. What I saw first were the bridges. Pennsylvania has thousands of bridges, more than almost any other state, and many of them are old, built decades ago, when the state was a manufacturing powerhouse. Jesus showed me that in April, multiple bridges across Pennsylvania would fail or be declared unsafe within the same week. It wouldn't be a single dramatic collapse that killed many people, though there would be some injuries. Rather, it would be a cascading realization that the infrastructure had been neglected for so long that it had reached a critical breaking point. I watched as inspectors examined bridge after bridge, finding cracks, corrosion, and structural weaknesses that made them unsafe for use. Major highways would have to be closed. Detours would route traffic through small towns never designed to handle that volume of vehicles. Commutes that normally took 30 minutes would take 2 hours or more. But the bridges were just the beginning. The vision showed me that water systems in several Pennsylvania cities would also begin to fail during the same period. Pipes that had been underground for 70 or 80 years would burst. Water treatment facilities with outdated equipment would break down. Residents in certain areas would turn on their taps and nothing would come out. Or worse, contaminated water would flow. Jesus revealed to me that this wasn't random coincidence. The infrastructure problems had been building for years, ignored by officials who were more concerned with immediate political concerns than long-term maintenance. April would be when all those delayed problems would come due at once. I saw frustrated commuters stuck in traffic for hours, unable to get to work. I saw businesses losing money because shipments couldn't get through on closed highways. I saw families having to boil water or buy bottled water for basic needs. I saw elderly people in apartment buildings struggling to carry water up multiple flights of stairs because the elevators weren't working due to water system failures. The economic impact on Pennsylvania would be severe. Companies would consider relocating to states with better infrastructure. Tourists would avoid the state because travel was so difficult. The reputation of Pennsylvania as a place where things work would be shattered. But Jesus showed me something deeper than just the physical and economic problems. He showed me that this infrastructure crisis would reveal something about priorities and values. For decades, Pennsylvania had been spending money on things that looked good or won votes, while neglecting the boring, unglamorous work of maintaining bridges, roads, and water systems. The crisis would force people to confront the consequences of short-term thinking and neglect of foundational necessities. It would be a wake-up call not just for Pennsylvania, but for the entire nation about what happens when you don't take care of basic infrastructure. Jesus told me that believers in Pennsylvania needed to prepare practically by having extra water stored and planning alternate routes for essential travel. But more importantly, they needed to prepare spiritually to be voices of wisdom in the discussions that would follow this crisis. He showed me that in the midst of the chaos and frustration, there would be intense debates about how to fix the problems. Some would want quick, cheap solutions that wouldn't last. Others would demand comprehensive rebuilding that would take years and cost billions. Believers who had wisdom from God would be able to speak into those discussions and help guide their communities toward good decisions. I also saw that this crisis would create opportunities for the church to serve in practical ways. I watched believers organizing water distribution for elderly neighbors who couldn't carry it themselves. I saw churches opening their facilities as rest stops for commuters dealing with massive detours. I saw Christian business owners showing grace to employees who were late because of infrastructure problems. The infrastructure breakdown would test Pennsylvania's character. Would people respond with selfishness and anger, or with patience and community support? Jesus showed me that believers who responded with grace and service would have a powerful witness to their neighbors. The vision shifted to Arizona, and immediately I felt an oppressive heat, even though I was only observing in spirit. The desert landscape stretched out below me, beautiful but harsh and unforgiving. Jesus showed me that Arizona had been dealing with water scarcity issues for years, but in April, those issues would reach a crisis point. The Colorado River, which provides much of Arizona's water, would drop to historically low levels. Reservoirs would shrink to the point where water restrictions would have to be implemented across the state, but the real crisis wouldn't be just the shortage itself. It would be the conflict that erupted over the limited water that remained. I watched as different groups began fighting over water rights. Agricultural interests who depended on water for crops clashed with urban areas that needed water for their growing populations. Native American tribes who held senior water rights demanded their allocation, which meant less for everyone else. Industries that required water for operations competed with residential needs. Jesus revealed to me that the enemy would use this resource scarcity to create division and conflict, where there should have been cooperation and creative problem-solving. Instead of people working together to find solutions, they would turn on each other, each group demanding that their needs should take priority. I saw heated public meetings where neighbors shouted at each other. I saw farmers angry at city dwellers, accusing them of wasting water on lawns and pools while crops died in the fields. I saw city residents resentful of agriculture, claiming that growing water-intensive crops in the desert was foolish and that their families' needs mattered more than farming profits. The vision showed me wealthy neighborhoods with green lawns, while working-class areas were told to limit their water use. The inequality became stark and obvious, breeding resentment. Some people began to hoard water, filling every container they could find. Others drilled illegal wells, trying to tap groundwater that was already being depleted. Jesus showed me that the government response would be slow and ineffective. Officials would propose various plans, but political divisions would prevent any real action. By the time they agreed on something, the crisis would have deepened and trust in institutions would be further eroded. But beyond the physical water shortage, Jesus revealed a spiritual dimension to what was happening in Arizona. He showed me that water is a biblical symbol of the Holy Spirit, of life, of spiritual refreshing. The physical water crisis in Arizona was a picture of a deeper spiritual drought. I saw churches in Arizona that had become dry and lifeless, going through the motions of religion but lacking the living water of God's Spirit. I saw believers who were spiritually parched, trying to survive on their own strength rather than being refreshed by God's presence. The physical water crisis would mirror the spiritual condition of many in the state. Yet Jesus also showed me that this crisis would drive some people to desperation, and desperation can lead to seeking God. I watched people who had been spiritually complacent suddenly becoming serious about prayer as they faced the reality that water, something they had always taken for granted, might not always be available. I saw prayer meetings specifically focused on asking God for water, for rain, for solutions to the crisis. And Jesus showed me that he would respond to those prayers in unexpected ways, not necessarily by making it rain in the desert, but by giving wisdom for water conservation, by opening doors for new technologies, by changing hearts to value community over individual advantage. He revealed to me that some believers in Arizona would become known as peacemakers during the water conflicts. Instead of taking sides in the arguments about who deserved water more, they would work to bring different groups together. They would remind people that they were all Arizonans, all neighbors, all humans who needed water to survive. These peacemaking believers would propose creative solutions that others hadn't thought of. They would organize community efforts to reduce water waste. They would help mediate between competing interests. And their efforts would be effective because they would be operating in God's wisdom rather than human political maneuvering. Jesus told me that believers in Arizona should prepare for this water crisis by reducing their water usage now, not waiting until it was mandated. They should be examples of conservation and stewardship, but even more importantly, they should be seeking spiritual refreshing now, so that when the physical drought intensified, they would have living water flowing from within them that they could share with others. He showed me that the testimony of believers who had peace and joy despite the water crisis would be powerful. When others were anxious and angry about water restrictions, believers who trusted God would stand out. People would ask them how they could be so calm about such a serious problem, and that would create opportunities to talk about the source of living water that never runs dry. The vision shifted to Louisiana, and immediately I sensed danger in the air. Louisiana is home to what's called Cancer Alley, a stretch along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where numerous chemical plants and refineries are located. The concentration of industrial facilities there is among the highest in the nation. Jesus showed me that in April, there would be a serious accident at one of these chemical facilities. I watched as something went wrong during a routine operation. Exactly what went wrong wasn't clear to me, but the result was the release of toxic chemicals into the air and water. The immediate area around the plant would have to be evacuated quickly. I saw families rushing to pack whatever they could carry, leaving their homes with no idea when or if they could return. The toxic cloud that formed would drift depending on wind patterns, putting people miles away at risk. But the real problem would develop over the following days and weeks. The chemicals that leaked into the Mississippi River would contaminate the water supply for communities downstream. Water treatment plants would struggle to filter out the contamination. Officials would tell people not to drink the tap water, not to cook with it, not even to bathe in it. I saw long lines at stores as people tried to buy bottled water. I saw families bathing their children with bottles of water because the tap water wasn't safe. I saw schools closing because they couldn't provide safe drinking water. I saw businesses shutting down because they couldn't operate without clean water. Jesus revealed to me that the company responsible for the plant would initially try to downplay the severity of the incident. They would release statements saying everything was under control, that there was minimal risk to public health. But as the truth emerged about how much contamination had actually occurred, public anger would grow. I watched as people who had lost their homes, their livelihoods, or their health demanded accountability. Lawsuits would be filed. Protests would be organized. The company would face enormous financial liability, but all the money in the world couldn't undo the damage to people's bodies or restore the sense of safety that had been shattered. The vision showed me that this disaster would disproportionately affect poor communities and communities of color. The people living closest to these chemical plants were there because housing was cheap, and housing was cheap because it was in a dangerous location. Meanwhile, wealthier people lived farther away in safer areas. This inequality would become a major issue. Why were poor people's neighborhoods the ones being poisoned? Why were chemical plants allowed to operate in areas where people lived? Who decided that some communities were acceptable places to put dangerous industrial facilities? Jesus showed me that this incident would spark a larger conversation about environmental justice, about how society treats its most vulnerable members, about whose lives are valued and whose are not. The conversation would be difficult and painful, bringing up issues of race, class, and power. But he also showed me the response of believers in Louisiana. I saw churches immediately mobilizing to help evacuated families. They opened their buildings as temporary shelters. They organized donation drives for clothes, food, and supplies. They provided emotional and spiritual support to people traumatized by the evacuation and uncertainty. I saw Christian doctors and nurses volunteering their time to screen people for chemical exposure and treat symptoms. I saw believing lawyers offering pro bono legal help to families who couldn't afford representation. I saw youth groups organizing water distribution to elderly people who couldn't carry heavy bottles. Jesus revealed to me that while the disaster itself was evil and would cause real suffering, the response of his people would demonstrate his love in tangible ways. The witness of believers serving sacrificially would impact many people who had never paid attention to Christianity before. He showed me one specific scene that moved me deeply. A church that was predominantly African American and located in one of the affected poor neighborhoods decided to use their building as a distribution center for clean water and supplies. The pastor, instead of being angry and bitter about the disaster, led his congregation in prayer for the workers at the chemical plant who were dealing with guilt and trauma about what had happened. That kind of grace and forgiveness in the face of injustice would confound people. The news media would cover it, amazed that this church was praying for the company employees rather than just condemning them. The pastor would explain that Christians are called to love even those who harm them, that Jesus taught forgiveness, that hatred only breeds more hatred, but love can break the cycle. Jesus told me that believers in Louisiana should prepare for this disaster by having emergency supplies ready and knowing evacuation routes. But more importantly, they should be preparing their hearts to respond with love rather than hatred, with service rather than self-preservation, with forgiveness rather than vengeance. He showed me that many believers would struggle with this. When you've been harmed, when your community has been poisoned, when corporations have put profits over people's lives, the natural human response is anger and a desire for revenge. It takes supernatural grace to respond differently, but those believers who did respond with Christ-like love and service would see remarkable results. People would come to faith because they saw something in these Christians that they wanted a peace, that surpassed understanding, a love that overcame natural bitterness, a hope that endured even in crisis. Jesus also revealed that this disaster would lead to some positive changes if believers engage wisely in the aftermath. The conversations about environmental justice and corporate responsibility would create opportunities for Christians to speak truth about stewardship of creation, care for the vulnerable, and the biblical principle that those with power have an obligation to protect those without it. Believing legislators, business leaders, and community organizers would have chances to push for real reforms, better safety standards, stricter oversight, more accountability for corporations, protection for communities near industrial facilities. If they act with wisdom and courage, real change could come from this disaster. Division of Louisiana faded, and I found myself back in that hallway with Jesus, having now seen 8 states total 5 that would face the most severe crises, and 3 others that would face significant challenges. The weight of all I had witnessed pressed down on me. So much pain, so much difficulty, all concentrated in 1 month across the United States. But Jesus reminded me that he was showing me these things not to create despair, but to prepare his people. Those who knew what was coming could pray, could prepare practically and spiritually, could position themselves to be lights in the darkness. The darkest hours just before dawn, he told me, and these difficulties would ultimately lead to awakening for those who had ears to hear and eyes to see. The vision focused on California again. I saw the earth itself begin to tremble. Not just one earthquake, but multiple quakes happening over several days. The first would strike in the morning, catching people off guard as they prepared for their day. Buildings would sway. Glass would shatter. Power lines would snap. But that initial quake was just the beginning. Within 72 hours, a second, larger quake would hit. Major infrastructure damage would result. Bridges cracked, highways buckled, gas lines ruptured, and those ruptured gas lines would ignite fires that spread rapidly through dry vegetation in urban areas. The firefighting resources would already be stretched thin dealing with earthquake damage. Water mains would be broken. Emergency services would be overwhelmed. The fires would spread unchecked through neighborhoods, consuming homes and displacing thousands of people. Jesus showed me that the combination of earthquake damage and fires happening simultaneously would create a crisis that exceeded California's capacity to respond. The psychological impact on residents would be severe, as they dealt with one disaster after another with no time to recover between them. The vision quickly showed me the other 4 states experiencing their own simultaneous crises. Texas facing a massive power grid failure during unseasonable heat. Florida struck by a rapidly developing hurricane. New York experiencing financial system collapse. Illinois torn by civil unrest and violence. Jesus emphasized that the significance was not just that these things would happen, but that they would happen at the same time in different parts of the country. The nation's emergency response systems would be unable to cope with 5 major crises occurring simultaneously. Resources that would normally be sent to help one disaster area would be unavailable because they were needed in 4 other places. The media coverage would show disaster after disaster. The psychological impact on Americans would be profound. Many would feel that the country itself was falling apart. Fear and despair would spread rapidly. But Jesus showed me that even in this darkness, there would be opportunities for light. Believers across the country would mobilize to help. Churches would send teams and resources to affected areas. Communities would pull together. And in the midst of chaos, people would see the love of Christ demonstrated through his people. As the final vision faded, I found myself back in the hallway with Jesus. The 3 dark doors stood behind us, and I trembled at the weight of what I had been shown. Jesus looked at me with compassion and told me that I must return to my life and share these warnings. He reminded me that warning is an act of love, giving people time to prepare spiritually and practically. He assured me that I would not forget what I had seen, that it was written within me, and that his Spirit would help me share it with those who needed to hear. Then the hallway began to fade, his presence began to dim, and I felt myself being pulled back to the physical world. I gasped for air as my eyes opened to see paramedics leaning over me. I was back in my body, lying on the ground in the park where I had collapsed. They rushed me to the hospital, but doctors found nothing medically wrong with me. I knew the truth. I had been taken out of my body to receive a message that I now had to share. My name is Wei Chen. I am a former Chinese military officer who never believed in near-death experiences or spiritual visions. But on January 17, 2026, Jesus Christ showed me 3 warnings about events coming in February, March, and April of this year. I share this not because I want the tension, but because I was commanded to warn people. In February, a health supplement targeting seniors will be released that promises cognitive benefits, but actually causes dementia. Elderly believers must be cautious, pray for discernment, and trust God for their health rather than pills and products. In March, a deliberately released virus worse than COVID-19 will begin spreading, targeting children and young adults. People must strengthen their faith now, refuse the spirit of fear, and trust God's protection while taking wise precautions. In April, 5 states will face simultaneous major crises that will shake the nation. But even in darkness, God's people will shine as lights, demonstrating His love and faithfulness. These warnings are not meant to create fear, but to inspire preparation. Strengthen your relationship with God now. Build your faith. Learn to hear His voice. Connect with other believers. When these events unfold, those who are spiritually prepared will stand firm while others fall into despair. Jesus told me that beyond these dark months, there is light and hope for those who remain faithful. These difficulties are not the end, but a refining fire that will strengthen those who endure. I pray you will be among those who stand firm, trust God, and shine His light in the darkness ahead.